Thank you all for coming. It's actually pretty exciting and encouraging to see how many of you out there are interested in outsmarting the world's greatest consulting detective. So really my presentation today is going to look at women who have managed to outsmart Sherlock Holmes and the methods they used, and then also give you practical tips. So if at any point in time you find yourself faced with going toe-to-toe with Sherlock Holmes, you have some tips in your back pocket that you can pull out and use to try and outsmart him. So you want to outsmart Sherlock Holmes. Something to keep in mind, Sherlock Holmes once boasted that he had only ever been beaten 4 times, 3 times by men and once by a woman. But if you do a close read of some of the Sherlock Holmes stories, you realize that there's other instances where women maybe didn't completely beat him, but surprised him, duped him, lied to him successfully. And so we're going to look at a couple of those scenarios today in this presentation and kind of break down what they did and see how the methods that they used could be applied to you if, again, you ever happen to be in the case where you need to outsmart Sherlock Holmes. But before we dive into some of the women who have been successful at this, let's take a step back and figure out what we know about Sherlock Holmes. So it's kind of the old premise of know your enemy. You kind of have to know what makes Sherlock Holmes who he is to understand how to exploit that to get around some of his brilliant efforts as a detective. So in the story of Scandal in Bohemia, Sherlock's best friend, Dr. Watson, described him as the most perfect reasoning and observing machine that the world has ever seen. So when you think about machines, you think cold, you think analytical, you think process, you don't think emotion and you don't think feeling. And you see that play out in a lot of the Sherlock Holmes stories. And it's words that Dr. Watson will repeat constantly throughout the stories, that Holmes really is this computer, this automaton, this processing machine, and he doesn't really show a lot of emotion. Well, if you do a kind of deeper dive into the stories, you realize that that's not necessarily true. In fact, in one story, Dr. Watson was shot, and Holmes just completely loses it and nabs the guy who did it and says, "You were very lucky that it was only a minor wound, because if you had killed Watson, you would not have left this room alive." And Watson was so struck by this feeling of emotion that he said that for a moment, in all of the years that he's known Holmes, he finally saw a glimpse of a great heart behind a great brain. And so this facade of being cold and unfeeling, when you dig a little deeper, actually shows quite a bit of compassion. And so that's something that, if you were so inclined to outsmart Sherlock Holmes, you can kind of use that. And we'll talk about ways that some women have done just that, have played on that sort of idea of compassion in him. As a personality, Holmes is very interesting and peculiar. So his personality, again, can be very cold and analytical. But he also has extreme mood swings. So when he's engaged in a case, he's very active and passionate, and he's just right there. He's doing everything and just super into it. But when he's not on a case, he falls into these fits of lethargy where he barely wants to even get up off the sofa, and he's just absolutely exhausted all the time, and he sleeps and he barely eats and he just kind of lounges around. He also uses drugs. He's a user of both morphine and cocaine to try and stimulate his brain when he's not actively engaged in a case. Now, if something strange or peculiar out of the ordinary comes up, he'll like switch modes really quick and go back into that almost hyper state of investigation. And so one method of trying to outsmart him is, number one, not even getting his attention, because if he's in sort of this lethargic state where he's not paying attention to what's going on around him, then that's the kind of Holmes that you want to go up against, not the guy who is fully engaged and has all of his faculties about him and is just committed to solving a case. In terms of his knowledge and skills, he's got very deep knowledge about criminology and forensics. He's an accomplished chemist. He's really good at finding these clues and putting things together. He knows all about little things like how a typewriter button might work or what brand of tobacco someone uses. So lots of little details about things that are relevant to forensics and to crime. He understands emotions as they apply to motives in cases, but he rarely exhibits those emotions himself. The other things is he is accomplished at self-defense. He is a boxer, he is a martial artist, and he is also someone who can fight with canes and sticks. He was attacked several times in stories, and he held his own in those instances. And so you probably do not want to go toe-to-toe with Sherlock Holmes in either a boxing ring or any sort of martial arts scenario, because chances are you would not come out the winner in that unless you yourself are quite accomplished in that area as well. Holmes has many weaknesses. So I mentioned before about this great heart that Watson caught a glimpse of at one time. It's shown in a number of stories that Sherlock Holmes has compassion, particularly for victims of abuse, for people that are tricked or conned or strong-armed into committing crimes, for people that commit crimes as a revenge or as a method of protecting someone who is weak or not empowered. And so those are all sorts of things that he has a blind spot for. If he sees someone is being hurt or abused, even if they committed a crime, he is less likely to turn them in versus someone who committed a crime out of greed or malice or revenge. In terms of his biases, throughout the stories, he exhibits traits of being racist and also extremely sexist, which we'll get to in the next slide in terms of his views of women. He has been, the language that he uses and the characterizations that he uses when describing people of Latin heritage, people of color, people who are Black, is quite disturbing to the modern reader. And those prejudices and those biases come through in several stories and several interactions. And as I said before, he has exhibited some pretty sexist language and behaviors. And those are things that, as a woman, if you ever were to go toe-to-toe with Sherlock Holmes, you could probably exploit to your advantage. So here are some of Sherlock's views on women. And I kind of broke them into two categories. We've got the sort of misogynist statements and the statements that are just clearly ignorant. And who knows, maybe they're all kind of the same category. Maybe it's a sort of artificial construct that I'm doing here by breaking them into two different boxes. But I found the end results of these quotes, all of them from Sherlock Holmes stories, kind of disturbing. I mean, like, the bottom line here is that he doesn't like women, he doesn't trust women, and women are secretive, women cannot be trusted, not even the best of them. And their motives cannot be easily figured out. So all very sort of shocking commentary here from supposedly a very enlightened consulting detective. So if you were in a situation where you were pitted against Sherlock Holmes for some reason, know that the first thing that he will think of you is that he won't like you, that he will not trust what you are saying, and that he does not admire you, and that he will look for every little clue or every little thing that you say and try and find some sort of motive for it. He will also likely think that you are holding some kind of secret. So even if you were a completely innocent bystander, Sherlock's initial impression just walking up to you will be a negative one. So if you intend to outsmart him, you have to make sure that you do so in a way that will kind of override these sort of default beliefs that Sherlock will have about you. So to kind of get more into some women who have been successful in outsmarting Sherlock Holmes, I thought it would be helpful to pull out a couple of women who really stood out to me in the stories, to talk about those situations, to talk about how they outsmarted Sherlock Holmes, and then to sort of condense their experiences into sort of a checklist. Like, here's some things that you could do if you were ever in this situation. So the first two women who outsmarted Sherlock Holmes that come to mind are Effie Monroe, and she is the woman on the left wearing the dress, and Lucy Hebron, who is her daughter, who is the little girl on the right wearing a white dress. And she's being held in the arms of her stepfather, Grant Monroe. So these two women hail from the story The Yellow Face, which actually is a really interesting story in itself. It has interracial marriage in it, and it has a lot of sort of racial tensions that sort of underlie it. But the basic story is that the man in this picture, Grant Monroe, went to Sherlock Holmes because his wife has been exhibiting some strange behavior. She was a widow from America that he met recently and married, and they've had a happy life until a strange neighbor moves in next door, a strange neighbor that he's seen through the window who has this glaring yellow face that seems wooden and inhuman. And he was kind of taken aback when he saw this person's face in the window. And he comes to find out later that his wife has been sneaking off to this house to see this person. She's been caught sneaking out in the middle of the night. She's asked for money from her husband for something that she wouldn't tell him what it was. She's just been acting really bizarre. And so this man, Grant Monroe, goes to Sherlock Holmes and says, "What is going on with my wife? I am so completely confused. What is happening?" And so Sherlock, upon hearing this story, immediately comes to the conclusion that that Effie Monroe, Grant's wife, that her first husband, even though she said that he had died, clearly did not die and was alive and had moved into this house and was blackmailing her for some reason. Well, I guess for the reason that she married someone else and that he thought that the first husband was trying to blackmail her to get money from her so that the supposed first husband wouldn't tell Grant Monroe that she was still married. So this is the conclusion he came to. So Sherlock and Watson and Grant Monroe go to this house with the creepy yellow face person in it. They barge in, they fully expect to find a man. They fully expect to find Effie's first husband, and in fact, find a little girl wearing long white gloves and this creepy yellow mask on her face. And when Sherlock Holmes takes off the mask, he is presented with a little black girl. Well, he comes to find out that Effie's first husband was in fact an African-American man, and they had a child together, and the little girl actually had yellow fever in America and was too sick to travel when the mother traveled to England. So she was left back in America with a nurse. When the little girl got better, she then was sent for to come to England. But by that time, the mother had married this other man, and she hadn't ever told him that she had a daughter, that the daughter was the product of an interracial marriage, and she was really concerned that her new husband would not accept her child. And so her idea then was to have her child live next door at this little cottage and wear a mask and gloves to hide her ethnicity. This was not something that Sherlock Holmes ever even imagined when he had come up with how the scenario would play out. I mean, he was thinking that it would be an evil or abusive first husband who was blackmailing his wife. And it turns out, in fact, that he finds this beautiful little innocent girl. And so the case took such an unexpected turn that at the end, Sherlock Holmes said to Watson, you know, if I ever feel like I'm getting overconfident, if I ever don't do due diligence to solving a case, please just remind me of this, because I was so wrong. I was totally off the mark. It turns out the story had a happy ending because Grant Monroe basically said to his wife, like, why would you think I would be such a creep that I wouldn't accept your daughter in my life? Like, we're a family. He picks up the little girl, he takes his wife's hand, and they go live happily ever after. And so it was a happy ending for the family in the end. But the ways that Effie and Lucy were able to outsmart Sherlock Holmes was because he did not take into account the factor of maternal love. He didn't even think about, he didn't correctly interpret her motivations. He thought that she was hiding some dark and evil secret without even coming to the conclusion that in fact it was out of love and protection that she was trying to keep her daughter safe in a in a completely white British neighborhood where her daughter probably would be the subject of prejudice. He didn't take into account that the motives of both Effie and Lucy were pure and innocent. Because he is a criminal mastermind and because he studies crime, his mind immediately went to, this has to be something criminal. There has to be something wrong here. And he didn't think about that in fact it wasn't. So those are some ways that they were able to completely blindside Sherlock Holmes and say, nope, that was not, in fact, what was going on. So another woman that I think really surprised Sherlock Holmes was Kitty Winter. So Kitty Winter is from the story The Illustrious Client. And the story basically talks about Baron Gruner, who is a completely evil person, a man who believes that women are things to be collected. He gets into relationships with women. He basically, trying to think how I could say this in a way that would possibly be PG related, but so he sleeps with the women, and then when they are of no longer any use to him, he either murders them or he throws acid on them or otherwise makes them undesirable to other men. And then he records his conquests in a book. So this evil man, Baron Gruner, was set to marry the daughter of a very prominent and illustrious person in England. And this prominent and illustrious person hires Sherlock Holmes to convince his daughter not to marry this evil, murdering creep. So Sherlock Holmes does all these things to try and get her to break up with this man. None of them work. And so he tracks down Kitty Winter. Kitty Winter is what was known in Victorian times as an unfortunate, but we know better as a prostitute. And she was actually a woman who Baron Gruner found when she was young and innocent. She became his mistress. And when he tired of her, he basically threw her into the gutter, where because of societal norms in Victorian England, unfortunately, the only option she had was to basically become a prostitute. So Sherlock Holmes finds Kitty Winter, brings her to this young woman and says, look, this is something that the man you're going to marry did. Like, he totally ruined her life. How could you marry this man? And, you know, she was very cold and distant and said, oh, this person is lying. There's no reason why my lovely Baron von Gruner would ever do anything like that. Well, Kitty Winter went a little crazy and tried to rip the woman's hair out because she was just that angry and that mad that this man had completely destroyed her life. So that interview didn't go very well. Towards the end of the story, Sherlock Holmes discovers that probably the only way to convince this young woman that her soon-to-be husband is truly evil is to steal a book in which he lists all of his conquests. And so he brings Kitty Winter into Baron Gruner's house in the hopes that they could recover this book. But what Holmes doesn't know was that Kitty Winter had secreted a vial of acid in her clothing, and when she encountered Baron Gruner, she threw it in his face and deformed him to the point that no woman would ever want to be near him again. And so that was not something that Sherlock Holmes expected. It was not something that he planned for, and it kind of took him by surprise. So And I think part of that was because he underestimated the true depth of Kitty's hate and anger toward Baron Gruner. So she outsmarted him by just this hatred, this revenge, this anger, all of those emotions that Sherlock Holmes claims not to have. He understands them as motives of crimes, but he doesn't understand them as something that he could experience himself. And last but not least, I know we're running short on time here, so let me just talk about Irene Adler. Anyone who knows anything about Sherlock Holmes, I'm sure has heard of her. She was a retired opera singer and an adventuress, and she truly was the woman who outsmarted Sherlock Holmes. She didn't use feeling or emotion like some of our other examples. She used her brains. Sherlock Holmes was hired to steal a picture that she had, that she was using to blackmail the King of Bohemia. And so he went into her house, he dressed up like a clergyman, he tricked her into thinking that her house was on fire so that she would grab the picture and run. And then once she accidentally revealed the location of the picture, Holmes left the house and said, oh, we'll go back tomorrow and we'll get it with the king, and it will be this big, amazing event that everybody will just be so surprised at how smart I am, how I was able to figure out where this picture was. It'll be wonderful. He gets there the next morning and the house is empty and Irene Adler is gone. And she left a letter that said, Sherlock Holmes, you did not fool me in the least. I saw you coming a mile away. And so, in fact, after she realized that Sherlock Holmes was the one who tricked her into revealing the location of her picture, she dressed up as a man and walked by his house outside of Baker Street and wished him a good evening as a kind of, one last jab to say, hey, look, you did not trick me at all. And basically, she figured out that it was Sherlock Holmes because she realized what he had done. Like, why all of a sudden would her quiet street, where her quiet house was, have a fire? Like, it seemed strange. Why would this clergyman whom she never met be in her house? So all these things just didn't add up to her. And Sherlock Holmes thought he was being so clever by using disguises and distractions and diversions. But when she stopped and thought about it, she was like, these things don't make sense. None of these things have ever happened before in my house or on my street. Why are they all suddenly happening now? So she was able to figure it out. And then she used cunning to kind of get back at him. So she wrote him a note and left it in the place where the picture was to basically say, I figured you out, haha. She dressed up as a man. She walked by his house. She called him out. I mean, she used her smarts to outsmart Sherlock Holmes. He never did recover the picture. She got on a ship, she sailed away, and that was the end of that. So Irene Adler was the person that Holmes was talking about when he said, I was only outsmarted once by a woman. That was who she was talking about. So, most of the examples I've given here have been women who have either outsmarted or outhearted Sherlock Holmes, like with their feelings and emotions. So some of the things they did, they used his own methods against him. Sherlock Holmes is an amazing actor. He could dress up as any character and convince anybody he's anything. And Irene Adler used that against him to, one, confirm that Sherlock Holmes really was the person who was in her house, looking for her picture. But then also to kind of rub his face in it a little bit and say, hey, you think that you're so great, you could do this. Well, I could do it too. Creating diversions or, there's a typo, diversions or distractions. That was something that we see in a story called The Veiled Lodger. One of the women in that created a diversion. She made it look like her husband was attacked by a lion by using a special club that sort of made it look like he was attacked by a lion. And Holmes was so focused on that he missed the obvious suspect. He was like, well, where did this lion come from, and how did it attack him, and how did it get out of his cage, without stopping to think maybe it wasn't really a lion. Avoiding direct confrontation when at all possible, because Holmes, as a detective, really focuses on details. He analyzes every little thing. He picks every little thing apart. And if you can avoid getting into a fight with him or even face to face with him, it ups your chances of actually being successful in outsmarting him. That said, there have been people who have talked to him directly and lied so efficiently and so effectively that he didn't even realize that it was happening. So if you're a very good liar, you could probably do it. But just be aware, Sherlock Holmes reads body language. He looks for clues. He looks for the way that people interact and act, and will interpret that. So emotions and feelings, I've said it before, they're a weakness of his. He doesn't understand them except as motivations for crimes. So if you have to go against him, out-harding him instead of outsmarting him might actually be a more effective method. And it's the one that Effie and Lucy used to be able to trick him into thinking of a more vile motivation while overlooking the more innocent and obvious the obvious thing. Also, Kitty Winter was the same way. Her hate, her anger, that was not something that Sherlock Holmes really understood. And so that's why he didn't see her coming in terms of her throwing acid at Baron Gruner. And then playing on his weaknesses. So I mentioned before that Sherlock Holmes does have a weakness for people who are victimized, who are weak, who are abused. There's actually quite a few women in Sherlock Holmes stories that are locked into physically abusive marriages. And in most of those cases, it may actually be in all of those cases, even if the woman was involved somehow in the death of her physically abusive husband, Sherlock Holmes let it slide. He didn't turn them into the police because he understood that the motivations of the women in those cases were out of personal protection, were out of fear, and really were because their lives were threatened. So an excellent example of this is Lady Mary Brackenstall from the story The Abbey Grange. She was beaten by her husband mercilessly. He killed her dog. I mean, he was just a horrible, awful person. And when it came out that she knew who the killer was, Sherlock Holmes let them go because he said, look, yes, that man killed your husband, but he also saved your life in doing so. So he did not pursue that. Whew. I guess that's it for tips and tricks for outsmarting or outharding Sherlock Holmes. If you have any questions, add them to the chat and Tracy will let me know what they are and I would be happy to answer them.
We have a couple.
Excellent.
So we're going to start. Leah Bardugo, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, writes, in Six of Crows, the best way to steal a man's wallet is to tell him you're going to steal his watch. What do you think about using Holmes's ego against him? Challenge him to solve one crime, but really be off doing something entirely different.
I think that's a great method. I think sort of that diversion or that distraction that you can create and have him going off doing something else is what really thrills him, especially a problem that doesn't make any sense. He loves problems that don't make any sense, but like just don't seem logical to him. Why? So one example is, I'm thinking of the story A Second Stain, where there was a crime scene and the police fully investigated the crime scene. And then when they come back the next day, it's been clear that the rug has been moved because the blood stain is over here, but the rug with the blood stain is over there. And he just became like fixated on like, why? How did that rug move? Like there were police here the whole time. This shouldn't be possible. And he was so busy focusing on that like the world could have exploded around him. So doing so creating that diversion or that distraction would be a great way to do what you want to do over here while he's fully focused on a problem over there.
Oh, That would be really cool. Yeah, I want to see it happen. Have you seen any modern reinterpretations of the Holmes character who has addressed any of these weaknesses? So I guess any of the modern reinterpretations of Holmes, have any of them addressed the weaknesses that have like occurred in the story?
I think so. So the one that comes most readily to mind is Sherlock, the BBC version, and you see just his disdain of women in that, particularly like Mary Morstan, and just how he treats her. Now, arguably, you could say it's because she is taking Dr. Watson away from Holmes when they go off and get married. But, you know, there is this certain like disdain, like, you know, I'm too good for you, that sort of comes across there. Although it has occurred to me that it's been a little while since I've watched Sherlock, so I probably need to go back and watch those again. I don't recall seeing those weaknesses as strongly in the Robert Downey Jr. interpretation. I feel like they made him a little more sympathetic to the women so that they could have more of like amorous type humorous situations with women versus the almost combative relationship that Holmes has with him. There's somewhere in here that, let's see, one of the quotes I think that I had up here there it is. So it talks about he was a chivalrous opponent for women. And that's just a very odd choice of words. Yeah. Like he really does see himself fighting like women are his enemy. So.
Do you have a favorite female archetype that Holmes has had to deal with?
So, I love a lot of the female characters, but for some reason, I don't know why, Kitty Winter has always been one of my favorites. I love her passion and her anger and the fact that she just says things like they are. But I think I also really like Kitty because I am a member of a Sherlock Holmes group that is specific to librarians. It's the sub-librarians of Sherlock Holmes, that's the name of the group. And it's the whole group is sort of revolves around the fact that in the illustrious client, libraries play a pretty big role because Watson's doing research about Chinese pottery in it. And so Kitty Winter is one of the characters in that story, and she has become like sort of an icon in the group, and we always toast her when we have meetings and things like that. And so I've written poems about her. So I have this sort of kinship with Kitty. She's passionate and she's fiery, and she is not someone who's going to let life tread her down. Like she could have just gone off and died in a ditch somewhere, but she didn't. She kept fighting and kept pushing back. And I kind of love that about her character.
And it's such an unsung story. Like when you think about Sherlock, like that story is not a part of like what you think about. And it's a really good story. It is one of my favorites. When you mentioned her, I had my camera off, but I was clapping because I love her. So we have a question. Did Sir Arthur Conan Doyle share some of the same views of Sherlock? I think it's as Sherlock.
Yes and no. So he had a very interesting take on women. So he was raised essentially by a single mother. His father was an alcoholic and was in and out of asylums a lot when he was growing up. And so his view of women was one of strength and leadership. His mother was she did whatever she had to do to keep that family together, to make sure all of her children were educated. And so he respected that, but also his mother read him a lot of books about chivalry. And so he also had this sort of women should be on a pedestal notion, which seems like it's at odds with each other, but sometimes not. And I feel like perhaps with his first wife, he had more of that up on a pedestal type of viewpoint of women, but you see it kind of evolving as Arthur Conan Doyle got older. His wife was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and she was very sick for a very long period of time. And during that time, he met and fell in love with someone else, which was a little complicated to say the least. And so he became somewhere in there a proponent of divorce, which was a very controversial topic in England at the time. I think not only because of his mother's situation where she was tied to a man who was essentially, incapacitated by his own alcoholism, but also because of his own situation where he was married to a woman who was far too sick to take care of herself in most situations. I think she had the disease for either 10 or 12 years. And he tried his best to get her healed and get her better, but, there was only so much that could be done back then. So he became a proponent of divorce reform, but then on the flip side, he was anti-suffragette. So he did not believe that women should have the right to vote. So he had this very complicated relationship and understanding of women. He's written poems about prostitutes that talk about how their situation is unfortunate and portraying them in a very positive light. But then on the flip side, he'll write female protagonists as very wooden and just not at all realistic. So I think it was something that he struggled with throughout his life.
And I think I have a question, and that was the last of the questions from the panel, but I have one last question. It's kind of a softball.
Okay.
Irene Adler has been done in almost every iteration of Sherlock. Which one's your favorite?
So I think, honestly, I'm going to say the Jeremy Brett version of her, because Jeremy Brett is my favorite interpretation of Sherlock Holmes. He was on in the 80s and 90s. So he was my first introduction to the character when I was a child, and he was the reason I got into Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle in the first place. She played the character very civilized and very restrained and very proper, but she also, you could tell there was a lot of intelligence behind her eyes. She wasn't just, this prim and proper woman. She was cunning and crafty, and she wasn't someone who could be easily duped.